This lecture will focus on the Native Americans and some of their last years in power and on their own independence in the western frontier. All right, we have a map here of the Plains Indians and generally where they were at this time in American history. And it's really important to understand just a couple of things about them. The Plains Indians, most of the tribes were nomads, and so they moved around from place to place. Their houses were the teepees that you think of often when you think of stereotypical natives. And so they would carry those with them and set up for a season and then move season by season by season. So it's more like a migration than a like moving every single day type of a thing. You would move, set up your little town or whatever, and then move again when the weather changed. And the reason that they moved, the reason that they roamed the lands is because they were following their food source, the buffalo. And the buffalo were very numerous in the plains at this time. There were lots and lots of them, and they would go towards the south in the winter, and then they would move back up north in the summer. And so, oftentimes, that would mean that the natives would follow them. And so, that's one thing to understand. They were nomads. They moved around from place to place. So while this is their general area, there was a lot of movement within it. The other thing that happened or that's important to understand is that they were not like one people. It wasn't just Plains Indians and they all spoke to each other and worked together and everything like that. The Plains Indians were divided into these small groups of people who lived in family groups mostly, and lived within their own family. So a village might just be a family group or a couple of family groups that worked together. And also, they had a lot of respect for nature because they understood that in order to survive, they needed that. They needed those natural resources, the food, the water, the oxygen, all that kind of stuff. And so they respected and protected that nature, unlike the settlers from the west that came in. And so, what ended up happening in the plains is the settlers came in and they would come in, they would find something that they wanted, whether it was land or gold or whatever, and they would break the treaties that had been set up. So the natives had been given reservations, given hunting grounds, saying that or said that the American people wouldn't live in that area, they just need to cross, right? And they would break those treaties. They would take some land, and it would force some of the natives to move, to relocate. So, as more and more people broke these treaties and started to set up towns in the land that was supposed to be set aside for the natives started to get angry, and they started to resist. And the way that they resisted was in a lot of different ways. They would go to the government, they would do a lot of these other things, but it also led to attacks on property. And sometimes, if it got big enough between the two groups, it could lead to all-out war, and usually when it led to all-out war, the American government would get involved too, as we'll talk about a little bit in the upcoming slides. So some of the conflicts that rose to this level are listed here. The first one is the Dakota Sioux uprising. This happened in Minnesota, not too far from where we are today. And essentially what had happened is the Dakota Sioux that used to have large tracts of land had agreed that they would live on a reservation that was provided for them and leave most of their land behind in exchange for annuities. An annuity is just a payment that should happen. It's like a consistent payment, so you should always get this money. And what was happening is those payments just oftentimes didn't arrive, so there was no money for these Sioux. They had been taken off of much of their hunting lands, and so these Dakota were living in this reservation in absolute abject poverty. They didn't have any money, they didn't have any resources that they could get, so they were literally starving to death. And so they went to the traders there in Minnesota, and they asked, can we get some food on credit? Like, can we get some food and owe you money later, and then when the annuities come in, we'll pay you. And the traders refused to give these natives food on credit, and so the natives started an uprising and killed hundreds of people, hundreds of settlers. Now this was shut down. The military did come in, was sent out, and were able to stop it, and they put together a tribunal, which is almost like a military court kind of system, and that sentenced over 300 Dakota people to death after this uprising. All right. When President Lincoln looked at the evidence, he moved that number down to about 38 that were sentenced to death, and other people, when the military came, had just run away. And so they all of a sudden became exiles. They became people that couldn't even show their face in their own land, this area that was named after them because it was their land, the Dakota Territory. Okay, and so a lot of the power of the Dakota died in this moment, and obviously when they agreed to go to the reservations as well. Another war is known as Red Cloud's War. This one happened in Montana. The Dakota Sioux is the group here, and the Dakota Sioux had won this area from other Native Americans in fighting with them and making treaties and all that kind of stuff as their hunting ground. And so they had three chiefs: Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse. And the American government was coming in and building forts. And they were building these forts all along this trail up into Montana, into the Montana gold country. And they were building forts right near, it's called Bozeman, Montana, right? And Crazy Horse brought a group of natives and came in and was able to do a small attack and get the commander of that fort to bring his 80 troops and follow this small group of natives and try and stop them and, you know, attack them and punish them for what they had done. And he ran them right into an ambush of hundreds of waiting warriors, which were able to kill these 80 troops. And this attack was the beginning of a war. The military got involved, came out, tried to shut it down. Really, on this one, they were not really able to, because these attacks just kept on happening over and over and over again. And by 1868, the Army had kind of given up its post along the trail because it just wasn't worth it anymore. This ambush was something known as Fetterman's Massacre. So if you see that on a timeline, on a map, Fetterman's Massacre was that beginning point of Red Cloud's War. So the Sand Creek Massacre is really an important thing to understand, because it kind of shows, it kind of shows the attitude of the American government and the military towards these Native Americans. But there's also just a lot about it we don't know. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we do know, but then I'll kind of explain what it is that we're not 100% sure on. So in the 1860s in Colorado, there was conflicts between these miners that were coming in, trying to get gold, trying to get silver, trying to get all those things, and the people that lived there, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho Native Americans. And so the natives were starting to get more and more frustrated as more settlers started to come in and try and take over this land that wasn't theirs. And so they started to raid wagon trains and ranches and all these other different settlers. Okay, so by 1864, dozens of homes have been burned, about 200 settlers had been killed, and so the government was about to get involved. So the governor of the area of Colorado was able to persuade the Native Americans to come in and surrender at Fort Lyon. Okay, anybody who didn't come and surrender was subject to attack. It's basically what he said. If you come in, we'll give you food, we'll give you protection, we'll give you all these things, but if you do not report, if you don't come in, you're going to be subject to attack. So Chief Black Kettle, in November of 1864, brought his people in to negotiate a peace deal. So he came up to the fort and talked to them, and the fort's commander, Major Scott Anthony, said, yeah, sure, we'll talk to you about it. Go down by the river, okay, go down by Sand Creek, set up your little camp or whatever, and then I'm going to wait for orders, and once I get orders, we can kind of talk about it. Soon after this happened, Black Kettle was setting up his camp, and Colonel John Shivington and a group of Colorado volunteers came in, attacked the camp. This is where it gets a little shady. We're not sure what happened here, okay? And so what ended up happening, some witnesses say that Black Kettle was flying an American flag and a white surrender flag or truce flag, and they came in and attacked anyways. And they basically say that the American troops came in and started firing on these Native Americans and brutally murdered hundreds of men, women, and children. Others describe it as a big battle where both sides fought for a really long time. What we do know is that not very many soldiers died. Not very many of these Colorado soldiers died, but we know that a lot of Native Americans died, men, women, and children. The number reports, they change from anywhere from 69 natives, men, women, and children, up to 600. So we're not 100% sure. There's still a lot of debate about what actually happened there, but for this one, it's less about how many people died and more about the intentions, right? Promises were made, promises were broken. This is a recurring theme in the relationship between natives and the American government. Take a moment to write out your answer to checkpoint number 1. So with all of this escalating, all of these issues escalating, Congress tried to make a plan that would work, a plan for peace with the Native Americans. In 1867, they put together a group called the Indian Peace Commission, and the plans that they came up with was to create 2 large reservations, one for the Plains Indians in the north, and then one for the southern tribes in the southern part of the plains. Okay, and there would be federal agents who would run the reservations, make sure they work out, all that kind of stuff, report back to the government, and the Army would deal with those Native Americans that would not report. If the groups refused to go there or refused to stay there, then the Army would deal with that. They'd come in and shut it down. This was going to fail from the very beginning. No matter what they did with this plan, it was going to fail because they didn't have enough of a presence out in the West. There just weren't enough people. There wasn't enough Army presence. There wasn't enough anything. And so while the government can pressure the Native leaders into signing treaties, they couldn't make the natives follow those. Even if the leaders wanted them to, the leaders of the natives couldn't make the natives follow these rules and stay on this land. And the bigger problem, they couldn't stop the settlers, the white people that were coming in. They couldn't stop them from violating the terms of these treaties. Okay. The other issue is this did absolutely nothing to solve the native issues that were happening and actually made it worse. The native issues of poverty, right? They didn't have any money to be able to deal with the American people and get their food and stuff in that way. Okay, that's not the way that their economy worked previously. And also, it didn't help out with the issue of the corrupt American traders who would come in and take advantage of the Native Americans as well. So on this last of the Native Wars, of these last couple, we're going to follow a lot of the same pattern we've been talking about before. So in the 1870s, the natives were leaving their reservations, trying to find their old ways of life, right? It wasn't working. They were dealing with poverty. They were dealing with all of this stuff, all of the issues that were part of being forced to live in a way that you weren't used to. Okay, and so they went, but the problem was they couldn't live the way they used to either because a lot of the buffalo had been largely killed, a lot by the railroad because the buffalo was coming through and blocking the railroad area, and really there were very few left. There was a small number of buffalo where there used to be many, and so part of this was now the natives were essentially forced onto these reservations, right? And the Battle of Little Bighorn came because of some problems with one of these reservations. In the Black Hills of South Dakota and parts of North Dakota in 1876, prospectors, people looking for gold and silver and all that kind of stuff, overran and took over the Lakota reservations. They were looking for gold. They found some gold over in the Black Hills, somebody did, and they rushed out there just like they always do. Okay, and the natives saw saw this and they said, you know what, you came out to our reservation, right, and violated the treaty saying you wouldn't come out to our reservation and do this. And so that means treaty's over. We don't have to follow it either. And so they went off to the mountains to hunt and to get some food. When they went off to the mountains to hunt and get some food, now they were violating it. And so the government sent the army to take care of this issue. Even though, again, this is the prospectors, the white settlers' fault, who were in their land taking over the Black Hills. And so the government sent this man right here. Okay, this is Colonel George Custer and the 7th Cavalry. Okay, and so this group of Army, U.S. Army people, under the lead of this man, really didn't think much of the native warriors. They basically thought, well, they're nothing. It'll be really easy to defeat them. Okay, the fighting power is very low of these Lakota people. And so in underestimating them, he ordered, against orders, okay, against the higher-ups' orders, he ordered a 3-pronged attack on June 25th, 1876. This attack was carried out during the middle of the day, so there was no hiding it, and it was on one of the largest groups of native warriors ever assembled in this period of time. The natives were able to turn back a cavalry attack from the south, and then they turned on the army. They turned on Custer and his men. They were able to kill Custer and every single one of his 200 soldiers. Now, the newspapers, when they heard about this, they made it look like Custer was a victim of a massacre, had been lured in by the natives and was a victim of a massacre. People in the East were absolutely outraged, demanded that the American government do something about it and send the military out. And so more troops were sent, and Sitting Bull fled with many of his many other natives to Canada, and others went back to the reservations. But then, in the end of this all, for their trouble, the natives were forced to give up the Black Hills as well, and just be in the part of the reservation that didn't have the gold. And so this just kind of that same pattern of settlers violating, natives get punished for it, and then natives get punished again for it. And so the final blows and really the end of the native way of life happened here, starting with the Nez Perce. The Nez Perce were a group led by Chief Joseph. They were refusing to move from where they were at that point to a smaller area of land, a smaller reservation in Idaho. And when the troops came to force them to do it, they ran, they fled, and they were able to run for about 1,300 miles, so a really long time out there. And then eventually they gave up, and in his acknowledgement that it was over, he wrote a letter to the government, and he said very famous words of, "I will fight no more forever." And this seemed to kind of mirror the way that the natives just had to give up at this point. They were defeated. Okay, and these people were then, Chief Joseph and his followers were then sent away to Oklahoma, to the reservations down there. And then there was a very, very sad, I call it a massacre, some people call it a battle at Wounded Knee. Okay, so what happened at Wounded Knee, it all started with a group of ghost dancers. Okay, and the ghost dance is a ritual, and basically what it does is that if they do this specific dance, then what will happen is the settlers will be gone, the white man will be gone, their ancestors will come back, the buffalo will come back, okay, all of them will return, and land will be like it was before, okay, life will be like it was before. Now, the government of the United States were afraid that this would cause more violence if people were getting together to do these ghost dances, so they banned it. But a group of ghost dancers did get together near Wounded Knee Creek, okay, and started to do this ghost dance. They blamed this on Sitting Bull, who had come back from Canada, and they said, you know what, this guy's been nothing but trouble, so let's go ahead and arrest him. And so they sent the police in to arrest him, and Sitting Bull's supporters tried to stop them. Shots were fired, and Sitting Bull was killed. A bunch of people fled and ran away from the reservation when this happened. The army followed them. On December 29th, near Wounded Knee Creek of 1890, a battle happened, I think of it as a massacre again, okay, where 25 U.S. soldiers were killed and 200 Lakota men, women, and children were killed in the fighting. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint number 2. All right, and so the next thing that happened, all of the fighting essentially at this point was over, and so the government had to decide how to deal with the natives. Okay, and they decided that the best way to do this was to help the natives to assimilate. Okay, and to assimilate means to absorb a group into the culture of another group. So basically, to take the natives and turn them into Americans, turn them into what we wanted them to be. Farmers, all that kind of stuff. And so the Dawes Act was passed by Congress, and the Dawes Act gave land to the natives. It said 160 acres of reservation land will be given to each person who is the head of a household. So if you have a family, the head of the household, the father, would get this 160 acres of land that were given to them. Okay, the rest of the land after that was done would be sold to American settlers, and all of the profits for that would go into a trust for the natives. So again, this reservation land is shrinking, it's getting smaller. They're selling it to American settlers because and just giving them money, okay, not allowing them to keep the land that they wanted. The other thing that would happen is the natives would instantly be given citizenship if they would live on their 160 acres for 25 years. Now this failed. This failed epically, failed very bad. It was actually just as damaging as anything else to the natives because of a few different reasons. First off, 160 acres was not much, and it was too small to really make much money off of. You couldn't really grow a good crop of cash crops, so it's a subsistence farming. And this is the kind of farming that these natives in the plains were not used to doing, and the land that they had been given was not great land for doing it. Okay, like I said, the natives didn't care about farming. They didn't want to farm. They didn't have the skill set to farm. They just couldn't do it. All right, so what ended up happening is few of the natives ever stayed the 25 years and stayed long enough to become citizens at all. And what would happen is once they owned it, once the natives owned that 160 acres, they could turn around and they could sell it to settlers. They could sell it to white settlers and move on, right? They can make the money, not be poor for a little bit, and sell it to those white settlers. So a lot of that land that was supposed to be set aside for the natives, well, some of it got sold off by the government, and then the individual natives needing money, having to do that, were taken advantage of by white settlers and sold their land as well. So a lot of um, the reservation shrunk away at this time due to the Dawes Act. In 1924, the Citizenship Act gave citizenship to all of the Native Americans, and then in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act took and gave some of the reservations, restored some of them, gave back some of that land, and then it gave natives control over their own lands. So at this point, right now, the natives are a sovereign nation within America. So they're part of us. They have to follow some of our laws, but they get to make some of their own laws as well. So they're their own country inside of our country. Take a moment to write out 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you have no questions, create 3 test or quiz questions that you might see given by a teacher.